Now, reading the paper, a man stumbles across an ad that catches him off guard. Cruise for $19.95. All right, sure, that sounds great. But being skeptical, he decided to call the toll-free number and just see. Now, sure enough, the lady on the other end assures him this is legitimate. He walks into their travel agency, reaches into his pocket, and grabs his wallet, pulls out $19.95, and slaps it down on the counter and says, "I will take you up on your cruise." "Wonderful," she says. She takes the money, reaches under the counter, pulls out a hammer, and knocks him on the head. When he wakes up, he finds himself tied to a log, which is attached to a sail, and he's floating down the river. At first, he's really mad at himself. How could I be so stupid? But after a few minutes, he calms down and finds that he's actually kind of enjoying himself. You know, there's a cool breeze, the waves are gentle, and then he looks over and he sees another log and sail floating just to his right. Another guy strapped to a log. Soon they find themselves floating side by side. "Hey," he calls to his new traveling companion, "do you know if they have refreshments on this cruise?" The other guy looks over and says, "Well, they didn't last year." Many Christians have discovered that it's possible to be a Christian for year after year and basically stay the same, making the same poor decisions over and over. Now, how is that possible? While you think about that, I have another question for you. Sand or rock? It's very possible to hear the teachings of Jesus and not put them into practice. When we only hear and don't obey Jesus' teachings, we find ourselves cycling through the same bad decisions and experiencing spiritual stagnancy for years. And we find that our churches produce church attenders, but not necessarily disciples of Jesus. Now, in the parable of the two foundations, Jesus explains the difference between just hearing his teachings and actually building our lives upon them. Matthew 7:24 through 27 is the parable of the wise and the foolish man. It reads, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears the words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash." So here are some observations about this parable. The man who built his house on the rock and the man who built his house on the sand both heard the words of Jesus. Just hearing the words of Jesus, for example, just coming to church and listening to the words of Jesus, is a start, but it's not the point. Both men get hit with pounding rain, rising streams, and these hurricane-like winds. Both lives get pummeled by stuff. That's how life goes for everybody. But in the end, only those who listened to Jesus' teachings and obeyed them is left standing at the end. In the parallel parable in Luke 6, 46 through 49, it's not about the location, rock versus sand, as much as whether somebody really digs down deep enough to hit a rock foundation or not. Both are interested in Jesus, but only one digs the foundation deep enough to where he hits rock. Jesus is essentially placing an equal sign between living a life that doesn't get destroyed and following his teachings. That is a ton of authority he is claiming. Now, I have another question for you to consider. How should we feel about Jesus' teachings? I believe strongly that when we hear Jesus' teachings, we should feel similarly to the crowds right after listening to the Sermon on the Mount. We read in Matthew 7, 28 through 29, the crowds were amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority. We also should feel amazed by hearing the teachings of Jesus. Amazed at what, you might ask? We should also feel amazed at Jesus' authoritativeness, the authority that he gives himself. The crowd that heard Jesus' Sermon on the Mount must have thought, who does this man think he is? The answer is, of course, that he thinks he's God. And it's actually one of the main reasons he's going to be crucified later. It's because he claims he's God. He knows who he is. And people don't want to accept that. Now, if we Christians are who we say we are, we will believe Jesus and follow, put into practice his teachings. I think we'll feel amazement when we hear them. So, sand or rock? A life that crumbles or a life that stands? A church that produces attenders or a church that produces serious disciples of Jesus? As the world, in so many ways, seems to be crumbling around us, we need to seriously get back to actually following Jesus and discipling other people in how to follow Jesus. I have 3 questions for us to work through to help us figure out how to really make Jesus' life and teachings the foundation for how we live and how we disciple other people. What is the world looking for? What does the world get instead? And what do we need to do about it? So first, what is the world looking for? In the book Mirage by Daniel McCoy, a professor at Ozark Christian College, he tells the following story. When I was in junior high, I was told to write a descriptive essay with lots of colorful descriptions. I giggled wickedly as I planned the story. It would read like a happy children's story, but end with a dark twist. I decided to write about Tommy and Billy jumping in their pile of autumn leaves. Yay! Hooray! Lucky, not wanting to be left out of the reverie, Lucky's a dog, bounded through the doggy door and into the fun, not noticing the snake that had slithered into the pile. Bark! Lucky yelped. Dad ran out, bent down to the dog, and said, "I'm sorry, boys. The dog is dead." The end. What is the world looking for? Answer: the world is looking for something in life that doesn't end like that pathetic story. Just one thing. Anything. And yet, we get scammed by life at every turn. You buy a lot of stuff that you think will make you truly happy, but stuff rots. You do a lot of fun things that you think will make you truly happy, yet lasting happiness is always just around the next corner. You spend your time and money chasing health and beauty, but in the end, as a wise person said, rather depressingly, you just end up as expensive worm food. You trust in political leaders, yet politicians disappoint us every day. You love people, and yet tragically, people die. Can you construct one of the great civilizations of the earth? Yet they all crumble. Everything ends with the dog dead. What is the world truly looking for? It's looking for something, anything, even one thing it can truly trust. What does the world get instead? John Stott, a Bible scholar some of you may have heard of, who passed away, wrote a commentary called Sermon on the Mount, in which he talked about what the world is looking for and what the world gets instead. He wrote of the hunger of our culture for something real, true peace, hope, and love. They truly crave these things. And our answer to the world, as Christians, is simple. We say, go to church. Check out the church. You'll find what you're looking for there. And yet, when they do go to church, what actually happens? What do they get instead? Now, here's what John Stott says in his book. The first place they should be able to turn is the one place which they normally ignore, namely, the church. And far too often, what they see in church is not a new society which embodies their ideals, peace, love, and hope, but another version of the old society which they have renounced, not life, but death. Stott is saying that people turn to the church to find what they're longing for, but it too often turns out to be more of the same disappointment. Stott continues, no comment could be more hurtful to the Christians than the words, but you are no different than anybody else. So what does the world get instead from us? What the world often gets instead is illustrated by the way some people play the piano. Reading music starts with things like, every good boy does fine. It's an acronym that helps them memorize lines on the treble clef. The end result of learning the notes, let's see, every good boy, oh, that's a B, is that eventually you shouldn't have to count up the scale. You just know it. Eventually, knowing the notes should come naturally to them. You should eventually be able to read music without even having to think about it. However, there are some people who skipped that stage of learning things. Learning how to read sheet music, for example. And they went on to play the piano by ear. They play what comes naturally, but bypass the more laborious and fruitful pathway of learning how to read music, and still sound pretty by playing by ear. Yet they're still probably going to be limited in what they can actually play. When it comes to living the Christian life, it is easy to try and do what comes naturally, to play it by ear. Yet the Bible includes plenty of habits for us to practice if we really want to learn the real thing. Lots of new habits to practice and old habits to unlearn. Here are some examples of Bible teaching, the Bible teaching us how to live the real thing. Romans 12:17, learn forgiveness. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Colossians 3:17, learn thankfulness, giving thanks to God the Father. Ephesians 4:25, learn honestly. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to your neighbor, for we are all members of one body. Learn honesty. These things aren't easy. It takes time to practice these things. It takes rethinking, relearning, and retraining. Breaking old habits and starting good habits. That's the kind of church which would tell the world that we have what they're looking for. A church that forgives each other. A church that blesses those who persecute us. A church that speaks truth in love even when it makes us unpopular. A church that is kind to everyone without exception. These sorts of things wouldn't necessarily make the culture like us, but if we really trained these areas, we would become that place of healing and restoration. A home for the prodigals, a hospital for the hurting, a place where truth is lived out. The culture would at least get the hunch that what they're missing is something that we've got. Instead, tragically, the world often sees instead a church that skips the training to become like Jesus and jumps to doing whatever comes naturally or easily. Now, doing what comes naturally might sound good to us, but compared to what it could be, compared to what's written in the Bible, compared to what the world is really looking for, it's extraordinarily limited. So the last question, what do we need to do about it? Let's review for a second. What is the world looking for? Something, anything they can truly trust. What does the world get instead? Instead of really training to learn the way of Jesus, many Christians just do whatever comes naturally as long as it sounds okay to them. And they look no different than the world. They don't offer something that people can trust. So what do we need to do about this problem? We've got to learn to live like Jesus. And yet, even though many of us have heard sermon after sermon telling us how to live like Jesus, it's no guarantee that we actually will live like Jesus. I mean, many of us have known, the two greatest commandments, the golden rule, the Beatitudes, and so on for a long time. But just knowing these truths doesn't automatically translate into living like Jesus. Our problem might have everything to do with who we think is the smartest person in the world. Who are the smartest, most intelligent people you have ever heard of? Who comes to mind? Einstein, Edison, Aristotle, Newton, Hawking. That's our problem. You see, we all think that Jesus is really good. He has amazing morals, compassion, love. But we don't typically put Jesus in the category, let alone at the top, of people who are incredibly smart. And we should. So unfortunately, we end up reading what Jesus said about how to live, and we say to ourselves, nice thoughts, impressive morals, but I don't think that's how we're really supposed to live. I mean, that doesn't really work out in the world today, does it? The philosopher Dallas Willard, in his book on the Sermon on the Mount, called The Divine Conspiracy, writes, "And we can seriously imagine that Jesus could, and can we seriously imagine that Jesus could be Lord if he were not smart? If he were divine, would he be dumb? Or uninformed? Once you stop to think about it, how could he be what we take him to be in all other respects and not be the best informed, most intelligent person of all, the smartest person who ever lived?" Often we hear Jesus' teachings on how to live, and we really do think to ourselves that we know better how to live our lives. It might not even be conscious, but that's what our actions say we believe. And that's our problem. We have got to truly start making Jesus' life and teachings the foundation for how we live and how we disciple people, how we train other people. Matthew 5:27-28. Jesus knows better than we do how devastating adultery is. He says, "Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Matthew 5:43-44. Jesus shows he knows better than we do how ugly favoritism is. "You have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Matthew 6:1. Jesus shows he knows better than we do how easy it is for religious people to get prideful. "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." Matthew 6:19-20. Jesus knows better than we do how just getting more and more stuff leaves you empty. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven." Matthew 6:15. Jesus knows better than we do just how close-hearted and unforgiving heart is. So even the love of God is kept out. "If you do not forgive others their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins." Matthew 6:27. Jesus knows better than we do how ridiculous worry is. "Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life?" The list goes on. Matthew 7, 1-2. Jesus knows better than we do just how destructive it is to be judgmental. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. Jesus knows. He knows better than we do. That's just a sampling of the treasures offered to you. You who desire to learn how to truly live. You have treasures in the teachings of Jesus. So now what? Jesus never said, make converts. In Matthew 28, 18-20, what he says is, make disciples. He said to teach those disciples everything he said, to obey everything he said. A disciple, and we've talked about this in the past, really means a student. The word in modern English that would best capture what a disciple was in Jesus' time is apprentice. Jesus gives us an invitation to train under him for our entire lives, to learn how to live properly from him, to become Jesus' apprentice, Jesus' student, his lifelong learner in how to live. And as part of that, we are to make disciples as well. We are to be disciples who make disciples of Jesus, using his life and teachings as our curriculum. We should be discipling our brothers and sisters in the church to grow as they study and learn from Jesus. And we should be discipling those outside of the church into a relationship with Jesus. Everyone should be a disciple who makes disciples. This is the mission of every Christ follower. And it is the mission of the church. So for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about disciple making, about being disciples of Jesus who make disciples of Jesus, who disciple our brothers and sisters into better, closer relationships, and who disciple unbelievers into relationship, into a discipleship relationship. We all trust Jesus with our afterlives. I have no doubt about that. But it's time for us to trust him with this life, with this portion, before we get to the afterlife. Jesus knows how best to live our lives. We need to believe that. That is what the world desperately needs. They need the discipleship of Jesus, training in how to live like Jesus lived. So, are we going to hear Jesus' teachings and think those sound nice, those sound good, and do nothing about it? Or are we going to hear his teachings and obey, put them into practice, be true disciples, and seek to create discipling relationships with others? Sand or rock?